In this video, I'm going to try to explain the supply and demand framework that is presented in Chapter 31, where he's coming from with that, and I want to make sure I do explain that because I know in one of the questions I have you do, he refers to the supply curve or the social cost curve as higher, and it's higher vertically, but it is not a higher supply curve, and I'm afraid that's going to cause confusion without this explanation. So here we go. In order to explain the model, first I want to back up and discuss something that we talked about very early on with supply and demand, just because, I don't know, hopefully it'll help bring home this bigger picture stuff that we're talking about with the environment. What I'm referring to from the beginning semester is our CDs, the used stuff that we could be sellers of. Maybe you don't have compact discs like I do in a closet, but you have something you could be the seller of. So if we think about that and think about the possibility of a little strange twist on things, I think we can get a stepping stone toward understanding the model in the book. So let's first model our supply and demand framework for, let's say, your used CDs or your stuff that you have in some closet somewhere, like in your room. There's the demand for it. We know that's out there. We could put it on Craigslist, eBay, whatever. Now, the supply for it, there are two ways we could look at the supply of just your stuff that you could sell. There's how much of it that you would be willing and able to sell at various prices. And let's think about that for just a little bit. The higher the price, the more stuff that you own that you would be willing to let go of, right? It's hard to let go of our stuff because we kind of enjoy it. We think, well, we might listen to that again one day, or I might wear that again someday. But at a higher price, we'd say, yeah, probably not. I'll go ahead and sell it. So we have an upward sloping individual supply curve, each of us, for our used stuff. So perhaps the stuff that you would be willing and able to sell of your stuff would have a supply curve like that. That's your supply curve, the supply curve for you of how much stuff that you would be willing to put to the market. This is how much stuff of your stuff that, I put a star there, I didn't mean to, that you would be willing to put to the market. And of course, you would command this price for that, and at that price, the consumers would be willing and able to pay and buy just that much from you. So this would be the price that you would charge, given what demand is, and you would sell that much of your stuff. What if I had access to your stuff and I could just sell your stuff? Wouldn't I be more willing to sell your stuff than even you are? If I could benefit from selling your stuff, if I got paid by selling your stuff. And that's because we have different costs. Like, for me to sell your stuff, there would still be costs. I would still have to deal with the customers and put it on eBay and take the pictures and ship it and all that kind of stuff that has to happen, just as you would. But I wouldn't be giving up any utility from your stuff, right? I would be more willing to sell your stuff at any price level than you would because my costs are lower. I don't share any satisfaction with your stuff. I probably don't even like your music, and likewise, you don't like mine. So you would be happy to sell my stuff. This scenario could be reversed. So my supply curve of your stuff, supply curve for me of selling your stuff, is some greater supply curve. So I would supply a lot more of your stuff to the market than you would, right? And likewise, then the price would be much lower if I were the one selling your stuff than it would be if you were selling your stuff. So we could have different supply curves depending on where the costs are being borne. That means applied, or who has them. So now let's try to look at that image that is in the textbook. Here's the demand curve for whatever good. It could be anything, or let's just say it's that. Now, if this is the private supply curve of that we've been analyzing back when we talked about supply and demand, then this is how much of that gets produced. and it gets bought and sold at this price. That's what equilibrium is. But what if there's some other costs to the production of that are not being borne by those sellers? Like this includes all the costs of shipping this good and making this good, employing the people to make this good, all the inputs to the good and stuff like that. But if there are some other third-party costs or costs that are passed along to other people or social costs that aren't being included there, if they were to be included, these firms' costs would be higher. And at higher costs, we know input prices is a determinant of supply. At higher costs, the supply curve would be somewhere left of the free market supply curve, because right here in this cost curve, or in this supply curve, which is representing the marginal cost of the firm, only the internal costs are included. If there are external costs that we could say should be included, it would be way back there. And that's why we have the supply curve that is private, and then the supply curve that includes the social costs. And we just call it the social cost curve. It includes all costs, including those passed on to society. So if we were to include all costs, there would be less of the good being produced because it's damaging. And it should command a higher price. This is now called, I'm sorry, I put a hashtag there out of habit, but this is really the optimal production of the good. And this is where we tend to focus, is down here. But I like to put this in there because it should cost more. It should cost the consumers more if they're buying something for which the market isn't absorbing all the costs. If it's being passed on to others, if it's an externality, the consumers ought to be paying more because they're partly responsible for that amount being produced. Why should they pay something less for the optimal amount than the optimal price? They're the ones that want it. That's what the demand curve tells us. They should be bearing part of that cost too, and they do. So that's the meaning of that model. And again, my parallel here is when I don't have all the costs, I produce more. When a firm doesn't bear all the costs of production, such as some pollution that goes out the smokestack, they'll produce more than they otherwise should because it's not all the costs. Both of these, my kind of abstract stepping stone example, as well as the social cost curve, factors in all the costs. Of course, that gets challenging because if you might have advocates in an industry that is a competitor with this or a substitute for this, and they might overstate how high those costs are because it pushes up on the price and the thing they're selling becomes more attractive. So, and then of course the firms in this industry and these consumers are likely to understate what those social costs are. So it becomes hard to know what to believe. And that's part of what maybe makes this challenging sometimes, is that what we're saying is if we could figure that out, this would be so. But no one's saying that's necessarily easy to figure out. I do think textbooks do a poor job of pointing out that it's hard to figure out. They just say it is what it is. In other words, listen to me, I'll tell you where it is, and I don't say that. I understand that this is why it's hard to understand this model. Sometimes is this idea that estimating this is challenging. If we could, that's what we'd be talking about. And that's the supply and demand framework that's in chapter 31 of Miller. In the next piece, I'll explain the marginal cost, marginal benefit model that's in there.